Yo, what's good YouTube? It's your host HD Samurai here and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm bringing y'all a new what if, this being the what if movie to what if Yuji had Obito's abilities. Thank y'all so much for tuning to this what if, and thank you to everyone for showing support and actually requesting of me to make a JJK what if. JJK has been one of the animes that many people have requested me to actually, do a what if on, but the thing is, I just simply did not know how to go about it until now. So yeah, this will be my first ever JJK what if. Hopefully you guys do enjoy yourselves. I'm personally am going to enjoy myself making this what if. And with that being said, I don't really got much else to really announce. So with that being said, let's get started.
You're never gonna make it, you're not good enough. There's a million other people with the same stuff. You really think you're different? Man, you must be kidding. Think you're gonna hit it, but you just don't get it. It's impossible, it's not probable, you're irresponsible. Too many obstacles, you gotta stop it, yo. You gotta take it slow, you can't be a pro. Don't waste your time no more. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
So to start off this what if, we're not going to start out with Yuji's life before he became a sorcerer. Now you see, growing up, Yuji would remain pretty similar to his canon counterpart. This being the fact he was gifted with amazing physical abilities that surpassed that of a normal person. But you see, the thing is though, that was not the only thing he was gifted at, as in this timeline Yuji was also gifted with an amazing intelligence, and not only that but also a photographic memory, as this would actually allow Yuji to excel even further when it comes to school, as he would always be placed at the top of the class, with Yuji always being there to help out and participate, causing him to actually become class president a lot of times. That or be like the hallway monitors, or really any type of activity that involves helping others, Yuji would always be there to fill in the role. And due to Yuji doing all this stuff at a young age, he'll be pretty popular as well. But that was not the only thing though, and it was the fact that throughout the time of Yuji actually doing all this, he discovered another thing that he was blessed at. This being the fact that he was very highly observant, being able to catch notice of things that most people would just simply ignore. Whether it be the fact that there will be this one kid that just simply gets ignored by everyone else, Yuji will be able to catch notice of him. If there was some shady activity going on, Yuji will be there to catch notice of it. Basically, Yuji was very highly observant. And it wasn't just when it came to sight, but also when it just came to conversation or communication. As whenever there was someone who was trying to make like a shady deal with Yuji or trying to involve him in something bad, Yuji would always be there to catch notice of it, as he would always put a stop to it before he actually went too far. As once again, this allowed Yuji to go throughout his school life going on a squeaky clean record. Until eventually we now cut to the very present, where we see Yuji currently right now spending his time in high school, as right now he was hanging with his friends, that being the Occult Research Club, as he actually joined them, which caused him to tell Yuji that he doesn't have to be here. After all, he has much more important duties, this being the fact that Yuji is the class president. But Yuji just tells them that he's actually pretty much fine with it, and he's glad to hang out here with his friends, which caused them to get very emotional. As we continue on moving forward with Yuji's day, eventually we see Yuji once again, as by this point he had finally finished up with all his class activities, finished up his class president meetings and everything, and was now actually heading off to go visit his grandfather. Now when he arrives there, his grandfather will be there to tell Yuji that he doesn't have to come visit him, but Yuji tells him to stop with all that nonsense, since he genuinely cares for his grandfather. As the two of them begin to have a miniature back and forth with each other, eventually Yuji's grandfather turns to the side before telling Yuji that he's a very kind child, and tells him that he should use those gifts that he has been given throughout life to actually help people. And Yuji, after hearing this, would actually stop what he was doing, as the reason why he stopped was because of the fact that he heard the tone that his grandfather was talking in, as he already knew what that meant, but still he needed to make sure. As he would call out his grandfather's name a couple more times, eventually after hearing that there was no more response, and not only that but also hearing the machine going completely silent and releasing the same humming sound, Yuji knew that his grandfather had passed away. So soon after reporting this to the head nurse and everything, eventually Yuji would be there just simply looking down and upset as he exits out the hospital. But on the way of trying to exit out of there though, he would then encounter Megami, as Megami tries to ask Yuji for the cursed artifact. Now when Yuji hears this, he's confused until eventually Megami describes exactly what he's talking about, and when he hears this, he explains that he gave it away to the Occult Research Club. This will cause Megami to immediately rush off, with Yuji asking what was going on, until Megami shouts that his friends may be in danger. And this caused Yuji to stop what he was doing, as this is when suddenly his grandfather's last words would then ring in his ear as he immediately rushes off. Now we see both Megami and Yuji eventually, after running together, arrive at the school, and when they do, Yuji is of course confused, since he doesn't completely understand what was going on, until suddenly they will then hear a ginormous boom going off, as they will see a large part of the school building actually being destroyed by an unknown force. Now when Yuji sees this, he immediately is surprised as he begins analyzing everything, just observing it just to make sure he can understand what was going on. But unfortunately, no matter how many times he looks at it, it just simply did not make sense until Megumi begins to explain that it's actually a cursed spirit, as he then tells Yuji to stay there as he then rushes off to go help Yuji's friends. Now after this, we see a similar sequence of events play out with Yuji contemplating what his next move should be until eventually he decides to actually go help out Megumi, as he ends up bursting through the window of the very school, actually making sure to get his friends away from the cursed spirit, and after that he ends up making an escape with Megumi as well as the rest of his friends in order to get them to safety. As after making sure that they were all safe, this is when Yuji has no choice but to face off against the cursed spirit, and during the time of trying to hold them back while Megumi thinks of a plan, eventually Yuji ends up getting captured, with him being forced to swallow up Sukuna's finger. And when Yuji does this is when suddenly a pretty drastic change of events would then occur. As just as the cursed spirit and Megumi look at Yuji in shock, this is when suddenly both of them would then be blown back by the ginormous wave of cursed energy, one so large that it would cause Megumi for a temporary moment think that Gojo had arrived. As turning our attention back to Yuji, we see him currently floating in midair, and as he does, Yuji's eyes were just transforming to a completely different color, as Yuji's once brown eyes were now transforming to the red eyes of the Sharingan. As Yuji would be there just casually floating in midair, this is when suddenly he would then fall into unconsciousness as Sukuna would take over his body. Now when Sukuna takes over Yuji's body, he'll be very happy to be back, as he'll be happy to see himself now in the modern era, but at the same time he'll be confused as he just wonder what the heck was going on with this kid's body. The main reason being the fact that number one, this kid was of course physically gifted and everything, but that was not the impressive thing, no. The impressive thing was the amount of cursed energy that Yuji seems to have within his body, as it was so overwhelming to the point where Sukuna actually thought that he got reincarnated into himself. But that's when he's then snapped out of it as he turns to the cursed spirit, as he ends up smirking, thinking that he's going to enjoy himself, but before he does, this is when suddenly someone's voice will then ring out, as he ends up telling Sukuna that while he does want to actually get to know each other better, unfortunately at this very moment he was too much of a risk. As Sukuna ends up turning around, he would then be backhanded so hard that he actually ends up falling to unconsciousness. As at that very moment, the last thing that both Sukuna and Yuji can see would be the face of Satoru Gojo, as instead of being all smiley and all goofy, in this timeline Gojo was completely serious during the exchange. As we end up doing a time skip. Now waking up a few moments later, this is when Yuji would then be face to face with Gojo once again, as Gojo begins to tell Yuji that he's actually on trial to be executed. Now when Yuji hears this, he's of course caught off guard, but immediately after Gojo ends up telling him about the term and agreement as well as what his choices are, Yuji does the same thing and decides to become Sukuna's vessel before getting executed. And this ends up causing Gojo to be pretty happy about it, as he ends up giving Yuji another one of Sukuna's fingers, to which Yuji ends up showing that he can handle it as well as handle the influence that Sukuna was trying to have over him. As now that it's been established that Yuji can handle Sukuna, this is when Gojo then formally announced to Yuji that he's going to be joining Jujutsu High, with Yuji not being able to say anything about this one, mostly because of the fact that he really can't argue about this. As moving on with that, and after making sure that Yuji settles in, as well as having a talk with the principal, we end up seeing Yuji in his new Jujutsu attire, now currently being joined by Megumi, and of course his new teammate, this being Nobara, as all of them were formed into a team, currently being taught by none other than Gojo. As after a little bit of a skill evaluation from Gojo, this is when suddenly they will then end up going to the detention center, as this will be their very first mission as a team, as currently they were tasked with the job of taking care of a cursed womb that appeared over the detention center. And after seeing how much this was affecting people, especially a mother who was crying for her child, Yuji gets pretty upset about it, but still regardless of that, he immediately gets a serious look as he tries his best to help out. Now when they enter the detention center, things play out pretty similarly, as at first they walk in pretty confident, until suddenly Nobara ends up getting separated from them. And before they can even get a chance to think about what their next move is, this is when the special grade then appears. Now immediately Yuji is able to actually force himself as well as Megumi out of danger, as thanks to him having much more observation as well as also being physically gifted, Yuji is able to dodge out of the way of the attack as well as Megumi. As this is when Yuji begins to look around, and as he does, this is when suddenly he begins to realize something. During the time of looking at the special grade, Yuji begins to actually see its movements before he even acts, as this would allow Yuji to avoid his attacks much easier and also allow him to last a lot longer in the fight. As he ends up eventually finding an opening after dodging another attack, he ends up taking a swing with his cursed weapon, to which this time it actually ends up landing, causing the cursed spirit to actually get a few distance away from Yuji. Now Megami will be surprised since even he couldn't keep up with it, as this is when Yuji, after taking a couple of shaky breaths, then tells Megami to get Nobara out of here and save her, as he will try his best to hold off the cursed spirit. And once they're finally enough distance away, he will then end up releasing Sukuna to take care of it. Now Megami tries to tell Yuji that it's a very stupid idea, but so far right now that was Yuji's best plan. That and something else, but right now it was way too risky, especially with Megami as well as Nobara's life at stake. So after a little bit of arguing, eventually Megami has no choice but to agree to it, as he ends up running away and looking for Nobara, all the while Yuji will stay behind to face off against the cursed spirit. Now when we see Yuji facing off against the cursed spirit, he does a lot better, as thanks to him actually being able to predict the movements of it, Yuji is actually able to dodge out of the way of its attacks and is actually able to land a couple of blows on the cursed spirit, causing it to be confused. All the while Yuji will be getting more and more hyped up about it. As the longer the fight goes on, he begins to truly see things a lot clearer. He's able to predict it much easier, and not only that, but he's able to already think of countermeasures midway through the fight, as this will cause Yuji to slowly but surely actually get the better hand of the special grade. As after doing this for quite a while, eventually Yuji ends up getting notified by Megami that him as well as Nobara had gone to safety. Now when Yuji ends up hearing about this, he's actually very happy, but the very temporary moment that he actually lets his guard down, the cursed spirit ends up taking advantage of it, as Yuji ends up taking quite a fatal injury, as he ends up getting damaged near his sides, causing him to cough up a little bit of blood and also causing him to be blown back. As Yuji ends up cursing for his own, narrow-mindedness, this is when he then gets up as he stares down the special grade, and when he does, he can almost feel the laughter of Sukuna just ringing in the back of his head. As we see Yuji curse one last time for his mistake, this is when we then see him swap with Sukuna, as we're now going to end up doing a miniature time skip. As the rest of the events playing out in the detention center will play out basically the exact same way, all the way up to the point where Yuji eventually ends up regaining control over Sukuna and ends up telling Megami goodbye before he supposedly ends up dying. Now during a time when Gojo ends up taking Yuji's body to Shoko, and right when they're at the process of disposing the body, we see Yuji currently right now talking with Sukuna inside the mindscape. As we see events playing out pretty similar to the main timeline, with Sukuna pretty much offering Yuji the same deal as he did, pretty much telling Yuji that in exchange for giving him control over Yuji's body for a certain amount of time, Yuji is going to be able to be brought back to life. And Sukuna even tries to sweeten up the deal by telling Yuji that throughout that time that he's able to have control over Yuji's body, he's not allowed to harm anyone, even making a binding vow with it. But Yuji, instead of actually trying to fight Sukuna just like he does in the main timeline and force him to bring him back to life, Yuji is actually thinking things over. As thanks to Yuji being way more intelligent and not only that but way more observant, Yuji's actually able to pick up on a couple of things. As Yuji ends up telling Sukuna that he agrees to the deal but under a certain condition. Now when Sukuna hears this, he immediately tells Yuji that he lost his mind. As he tells Yuji that if he even thinks for even a second that he's the one allowed to make demands here, then he must have completely just lost his mind completely. As after all, Sukuna would gladly allow Yuji to die. In fact, it would make things way easier for him. As after all, at the end of the day, he will still be the strongest as he ever has been, even if he lost a couple of his fingers. But you see, the thing is, Yuji was way more observant. He was able to catch on things, and the more important thing that he was actually able to catch on was the fact that why was Sukuna even trying to make this deal in the first place? As after all, this is Sukuna, King of Curses, and he's the one who's actually trying to bring up a deal with the same person that Sukuna has told Yuji multiple times that he hated Yuji. But now here he is trying to make a deal with him. Then something must have interested the King of Curses, enough to make him to actually make a deal with the very thing that he hates the most. Now that something must have been extremely good and it must have gotten his attention. So with those thoughts in mind, this is when Yuji then tells Sukuna that it's either that he accepts the conditions or both of them can die right here, right now. It won't really make that much of a big difference. Now when Sukuna heard this, he immediately got pissed off and annoyed, as he begins to release a buttload of killing intent onto Yuji before asking him just exactly who does he think he is. As Sukuna ends up looking at Yuji directly in the eyes with a ginormous amount of killing intent, Yuji does not even flinch at it, as he just stares calmly at the so-called King of Curses. As Sukuna continues glaring at Yuji before trying to ask him if he wants to fight or something, as he actually says that that might be a good way to settle it. If they fight, if Yuji ends up winning, then Sukuna will bring him back without any deal at all. But if he wins, then Yuji has to agree to it. But Yuji actually ends up declining it immediately, telling Sukuna that it was either he accepts the conditions or that's it. This was it for the both of them. Now when Sukuna hears this, he's once again pissed off, as he then ends up finally releasing out an angry sigh before telling Yuji that fine, he agrees, but only because Yuji is way too annoying. As after hearing this, Yuji just simply nods before telling Sukuna that while he agrees with everything else, he also wants Sukuna to actually train him personally. Now when Sukuna heard this, he looks at Yuji once again, as he now glares angrily at Yuji for even dare thinking that he has the right to get training from Sukuna himself. As he glares angrily at Yuji before having no choice but to sigh as he ends up agreeing to the deal. As he ends up turning his back to Yuji, as Yuji then erupts in flames as he was getting forced out of the mindscape, this is when Sukuna ends up letting Yuji know, as his final words to Yuji being the fact that when he ends up getting released out of Yuji, when he's finally released from this prison, the very first person he's going to kill, he decided to change his target. It wasn't going to be Satoru Gojo, no. He was going to kill Yuji, and he was going to make sure to enjoy it. And right as Yuji was getting erupted in flames and completely about to be gone out of the mindscape, the last thing that Sukuna would hear from Yuji would be the fact that he would be expecting him. As Sukuna ends up turning around, only to see Yuji staring at him directly in the eyes with a cold expression, as he didn't even react in one bit as the flames would hit him and as he would be completely burnt to a crisp out of the mindscape, as Sukuna ends up glaring angrily at Yuji before walking back to his throne. And during the time of walking back to his throne, Sukuna could just simply wonder, why? Why did the universe create something so amazing, something that has so much potential, and give it to the most boring, simple-minded, and most annoying person to have ever existed like Yuji Itadori? As Sukuna could literally feel the influx of cursed energy, the amazing physical strength, and something else, a cursed technique that Sukuna has never seen before, but yet this world decides to give it to the most boring and simple-minded person like Itadori Yuji, someone whose philosophy completely contradicts Sukuna's own, as he just simply ends up getting angry just thinking about it, getting annoyed and honestly just wishing death upon the brat. But unfortunately right now, Sukuna can do nothing at the very moment, as all he can do right now is sit there and bide his time until eventually he will be released from this prison. And when he does, he will make sure to show everyone why he was deemed as the king of curses. As this is where we then do a time skip. Moving past this scene, we end up turning to the next couple of weeks actually that went by after the event. Now throughout that time, we actually see Yuji, after waking up, then immediately get interrogated by Gojo, as he wanted to know exactly what went down and if Yuji made any special deal with Sukuna, with Yuji bluntly telling him that yes he did. And when Gojo heard this, he immediately laughs in Yuji's face, telling him that he's crazy and that if anyone weaker had actually done that, then they would have most definitely had died already. But Yuji just simply shrugs and responds before asking Gojo if he could train him, with Gojo revealing that he actually already planned on doing so, as throughout the next couple of weeks that went by, Yuji will be getting trained by Gojo, but not only Gojo but also Sukuna. Which a little bit of a fun fact here, but Gojo as well as Sukuna's training methods will be polar opposites of each other. As while Gojo will tell Yuji to relax and watch movies while also keeping his emotions in check, Sukuna will be beating the living crap out of Yuji while in the mindscape, as every single time Sukuna's training of Yuji would just be simply fighting against him, and really that fighting was just to find new ways to punish Yuji, as whether it be cutting him up until there was nothing left, burning him to a crisp, bringing out Malevolent Shrines so that way he can just continue cutting up Yuji, making sure to cut off the most sensitive part of his bodies. It didn't matter. Sukuna went through every single way of just simply beating the crap out of Yuji and finishing him off in the mindscape. But you see, the thing is, although this was just a sick way to actually, punish Yuji, Yuji was actually improving because of this. As thanks to him fighting Sukuna constantly in the mindscape, and even though he lost every single time, Yuji got way better when it comes to actually understanding battle experience and everything. As he was able to predict movements much easier, his physical strength and speed and everything actually got increased as well. His control over his cursed energy got even better, and not only that, but thanks to all the training that he got from both sides, this will cause Yuji to actually awaken his cursed technique. Which, speaking of Yuji's cursed technique, both Gojo as well as Sukuna will be interested in what his capabilities are. As so far, they have not seen everything he's able to do, but yet at the same time, they've seen enough to see that it was going to be very powerful. As from all the training that Yuji has received from the two of them, they have learned a couple of his capabilities, but not all of them. The main one being the fact that Yuji is actually able to predict attacks before they even happen, and number two is the fact that Yuji is able to copy movement. As throughout the times of fighting Sukuna in the mindscape, Yuji has been able to copy the fighting style of Sukuna to a certain extent. And while he does that, Yuji has also incorporated his own into it, as pretty much Yuji has been combining his own fighting style along with Sukuna's, making this new version of it, as this will make Yuji even more powerful than his canon counterpart. And the craziest thing about all of it that really surprises Gojo and even Sukuna is the fact that Yuji's curse technique evolves even further. As Yuji's curse technique, which I'm just going to say its name finally, the Sharingan, I mean it was pretty obvious but still, I'm just going to say Sharingan from now on. But yeah, basically Yuji's Sharingan continue evolving thanks to all the training. As early on in the beginning of the training, Yuji had awakened it and it would be at the first Tomoe. But then later down the line, during the end of the few weeks of training, eventually Yuji would have at the current moment a 3 Tomoe Sharingan. As witnessing these evolutions happening during the time of training Yuji, this would cause Gojo to already think in his mind that Yuji was surpassing a large amount of his expectation, as at the very moment he would think that Yuji is at grade 1 sorcerer level, maybe even further. But right now, the one thing that Yuji was most definitely lacking in was actual field experience, which is why Gojo decided to do the very next part, which, just like in the main timeline, he decided to set Yuji up with Nanami, as he decided to let Nanami show Yuji the ropes of being a sorcerer, and how it's like actually out there in the field. As we now change scenes, as well as cut back to the present. Now we currently see Yuji and Nanami as they end up investigating the scene of a murder that happened at a cinema. Now while they're there investigating, eventually they'll run up on a couple of cursed spirits, as they would actually find out that those very cursed spirits were the same people that were murdered in the cinema, as they were turned into these weird like curses. As this will cause both Nanami and Yuji to have no choice but to exorcise them, which during the time of exercising them, Nanami did take notice of the fact of how strong Yuji was, and was genuinely impressed by the fact that Gojo seemed to actually know what he was doing when it came to teaching the kid. But still, regardless of that, we still have to see both Yuji and Nanami separate for a little while, as we end up seeing similar events play out just like the main timeline, where Nanami ends up running up on Mahito and both of them end up fighting, all the while Yuji ends up encountering Junpei and soon ends up befriending him. As after a nice dinner between Junpei and its mother as well as Yuji, eventually Yuji has to leave and actually says goodbye to Junpei, with Junpei being quite happy about the fact that he made a pretty good friend like Yuji. But unfortunately, just like every other happy moment, they unfortunately have to come to an end. Except for Junpei, this end was very devastating. As during the night, as of course Junpei's mother was just relaxing, Sukuna's finger would appear, and as she looks at it, a cursed spirit would appear and also end up killing her, causing the untimely end of Junpei's mother. Now this will cause Junpei to immediately grieve, with Mahito deciding to actually use that to his advantage and tell and order Junpei to attack his classmates, to which Junpei would do so. And just like in the main timeline, Yuji would have to interfere, but this time he prevents Junpei from going any further, and he does so much sooner. As after talking it over with the guy, he sees that Junpei was just grieving and decides to try to help him. But just as he was about to do so, this is when suddenly Yuji would then see Mahito approaching. And when he does, he can immediately tell that something was wrong, as he ends up pushing Junpei out of the way and stands right in front of him in order to protect him from Mahito. Now when Mahito sees Yuji, he would actually be surprised by the fact that Yuji was able to get to Junpei quicker than him, as he actually compliments Yuji for that. But Yuji says nothing more, as he tells Mahito that he knows that he's a cursed spirit, and tells Mahito that he has no choice but to exorcise him. Now when Junpei hears this, he tries to tell Yuji that Mahito is a friend, and that he isn't someone bad, but this is when Mahito then laughs directly in Junpei's face, telling him that he's pathetic, as this is when he then begins to actually reveal the whole thing, saying that he actually was one of the people associated with the untimely end of his mother, as this will cause Junpei to immediately nearly break after hearing that, as he gets into a very angry rage as he tries to attack Mahito with his curse technique, but unfortunately Mahito just simply shrugs it off, telling Junpei that that was useless, just like him. But before he gets any further in being a completely cliche villain, this one suddenly Mahito would then be backhanded out of the school building, as he'll be right outside, and he'll be outside so quickly that he'll be caught off guard by it, just wondering how he even got here in the first place. As after getting sent flying and getting rolled around on the ground, this is when Mahito would then look up only to see Yuji just there staring at him coldly. As Yuji would snap out of it temporarily to look at Junpei, as he looks at him sadly, feeling disappointed in himself for the fact that he wasn't able to save Junpei's mother. This is when Yuji would then snap his attention back to Mahito before telling him in a cold dark tone that he was going to kill him, and nothing was going to stop him. And when Mahito heard this, he smiled, as he tells Yuji to bring it on, with Yuji then suddenly disappearing as he once again blitzes the cursed spirit, as him and Mahito will then get into hand-to-hand combat. And to Mahito's absolute surprise, he will begin to get quickly overwhelmed by Yuji and soon be proven that he couldn't do anything against the boy, as for some weird reason Yuji had been able to predict Mahito's attacks thanks to the Sharingan, of course, not that Mahito knew about it, and not only that, but he had been able to counter it perfectly, as Yuji was doing way more damage to Mahito than even Nanami had done, and Nanami had been a sorcerer for multiple years apparently. As once again we will see Mahito get overwhelmed, this is when he begins to actually feel something click. And right before he begins to actually truly wonder on it, this is when suddenly Nanami wouldn't actually enter the scene, as he tells Yuji that was a good job and he immediately jumps in, as both Yuji and Nanami begin to jump the crap out of Mahito. But the thing is, they were actually helping Mahito at the very moment, as Mahito begins to slowly but surely awaken his domain expansion. As he ends up awakening it just at the very moment, as he ends up slapping Yuji aside and ends up trapping Nanami within. As just as it seemed as if Nanami was actually about to die, this is when Yuji would then break through the domain, as he was the perfect counter to Mahito. And when Yuji enters the domain, this is when Mahito would then actually end up appearing right in front of Sukuna. And by this point, Sukuna was really pissed off, not only because of the fact of how terrible Mahito was doing, but also because of the fact that Yuji was actually thriving after everything he put him through. As he ends up looking at Mahito with disgust before telling him that he was a failure. As this is when he ends up using Cleave on Mahito, dealing the cursed spirit a large amount of damage, as this is when, just like in the main timeline, both Yuji as well as Nanami once again get back to jumping him. As this will continue on until eventually Mahito was able to get away, as he would distract both Yuji as well as Nanami. As now that Mahito had been finally far away, we can finish this up, with the only real difference here being the fact that Junpei was still alive. And speaking of Junpei, during the conclusion of all this, Junpei would be there very sad and very lost, mostly because of the fact that now that he lost his mother, he has no idea what to do next. Just as if things were about to seem completely hopeless for him, this is when Yuji would then firmly approach the boy and then actually end up reaching out a hand to him before asking Junpei formally if he wants to join Jujutsu High. As this is where we then see Yuji begin to explain the process of being a sorcerer before telling Junpei that if he ends up joining that he won't have to be alone. As after all, Yuji is Junpei's friend. And after hearing this, Junpei would of course think about it for a little moment before eventually he ends up accepting it. As just like that, Yuji ends up leaving this arc with Junpei still being alive and joining Jujutsu High, but at the same time Yuji felt as if he could improve, he could have done better. So with that thought in mind, Yuji decides to approach Gojo and even Nanami, as he asks the both of them if they can give him any more additional tips or if they can just flat out, train him to become even stronger. With Gojo deciding to do so while Nanami gives Yuji a couple of tips before heading off to clock out. As we now do another time skip, as we now flash towards the Goodwill event. As starting off the Goodwill event, we see both teams end up arriving there, as both of them will be staring down at each other, as well as the teachers that eventually end up arriving. Now when the teachers end up arriving, this is when we then see Gojo approaching with the generous box, and alongside Gojo will be Junpei in his new Jujutsu attire. As we see the events leading up to Yuji's reveal playing out pretty similarly, with the only difference here being the fact that Junpei is, they're included among them. As by the time Yuji reveals himself, everyone is surprised and everything, but still nonetheless end up moving on. Yuji's teammates are of course upset with him for hiding the fact that he was still alive after all this time, but still regardless of that, they decide to clue him in on the plan. As after explaining everything and realizing that, well, Yuji was not really going to be of use to them, or at least that's what they thought, this is when Megumi ends up letting them know about the key detail that if there was no cursed energy at all, and it was just a simple fight between all of them, Yuji will still win. So due to that, this is when they then decide to add Yuji into the plan and also Junpei, after Junpei had explained his curse technique. As after that we then move forward, as this is where we then see the events then play out. As the entire Tokyo squad begins to go and move throughout the entire forest, this is when suddenly Todo begins to intervene and intercept them, with of course the rest of the team telling Yuji to take care of that, to which he will do so. As we see both Yuji and Todo then head off to each other, as they will then clash, this is when Todo would then be surprised, as when it came to a contest of strength, he unfortunately was not able to beat Yuji, as Todo would actually be sent flying from that one blow from Yuji and actually feel a bit of pain in his arm, as he ends up flipping over and recovering his balance before complimenting Yuji about his strength, to which Yuji just simply ends up thanking him before getting into a fighting stance, as the two of them would then rush off at each other. Now to Todo's surprise, Yuji, he was fighting beautifully, at least in Todo's eyes at least, as Yuji, using the Sharingan, had been able to actually predict and counter Todo's moves perfectly, while at the same time he had been learning to adapt to anything that Todo had threw at him, as anything that Yuji was not able to actually predict, he had been able to adapt to relatively easily, as this will cause Todo to be even more impressed before finally he just had to ask Yuji the question, what was his type of woman? With Yuji with no type of shame at all just telling him that he likes big butt women, with Todo having to give Yuji that respect. As after that, this is when Todo then admits to Yuji that Yuji is now his best friend, with Yuji being confused about it but still nonetheless accepting it. But as this was going on, this is when the Kyoto squad would then appear, as they were there to execute Yuji just like the teacher had told them to. But this is when Todo then intervenes, giving them that one last warning before getting back to fighting Yuji. With them having no choice but to accept it, since if Todo said so, then they have no choice. He was the strongest one out of all of them. As after that, we will then see the rest of the fights then play out pretty similar to the main timeline, as the only difference here being the fact that since Junpei is included, he'll be the one to replace Mai fighting off against, Miwa. So that means it'll be Junpei versus Miwa. But nonetheless, it doesn't really change anything since the fights still get interrupted and the entire event gets interrupted by Hanami, who makes her appearance known. And when she's there, this is when suddenly, as the rest of them are trying to fend off against her, this is when Todo and Yuji would then end up arriving, with both of them immediately springing into action. As we see Yuji and Todo facing off against Hanami, this is when we then see the same scene with Todo telling Yuji that he's not going to help him unless he ends up landing a Black Flash. But not landing just one, not landing just two, but landing 3 Black Flashes, as this will cause Todo to be very impressed and also surprise Yuji since his control over cursed energy had just gotten amped. But before Yuji gets a chance to really properly ponder on this is when Hanami then decides to activate her secret technique, as this will cause both Todo and Yuji to have no choice but to fight more carefully. But you see, throughout the fight, as both Todo and Yuji are fighting, this is when we then see Yuji beginning to already think of a different plan and strategy, as thanks to the influx of new control over his cursed energy, this is when Yuji then begins to get an idea. As this is when suddenly Yuji in an instant begins to go through a bunch of hand signs, while Todo begins to ask Yuji what exactly he's planning, with Yuji just simply telling Todo to jump when he tells him to, and Todo says nothing more, putting full faith into his brother. As this is when the two of them continue dodging out of the way out of all of Hanami's attack, until eventually Yuji would then release the signal, as they would then both jump at the same time high up into the air, as Hanami will look on in confusion before summoning out a bunch of vines and shooting them towards both Yuji and Todo, intending on finishing them off while they're in the air. But you see, this is when Yuji would then blitz through hand signs, his eyes closed with full concentration being shown on his face, before finally he would then open them, as a spiraling wave of flames would then be released from Yuji's mouth, and when it does, it will end up burning through the vines that Hanami has sent out, and actually end up hitting Hanami straight on, as you will see the cursed spear burning and taking heavy damage from the blow, until finally by the time Yuji was done with the attack, you will see Hanami again, but this time she would be heavily burnt, as she seemed to be at her limit. As Todo looks on with an impressive look on his face, this is when he then tells Yuji that it was time to end it, with Yuji agreeing. But before they get to do so, this is when Hanami then prepares to use her domain. But just before she does so, this is when Gojo then intervenes, as the whole sequence of events with Hanami end up escaping still end up playing out, but Gojo does show off why exactly he was known as the strongest, with Yuji being even more impressed with his teacher. As after that whole goodwill event and everything, we see the rest of them end up playing a small miniature baseball game to decide it, all the while they decide to kind of hold off on Yuji's execution for now, as they decide to wait and see how things play out. As now that we're done with this, we can now move on forward with the story, all the way to the point where we get to Yusahachi Bridge. Now, this point of this timeline will be mostly meant to actually discover more about Megami, but also about the fact that there has been a curse that has been affecting everyone in his hometown and was also having an effect on his sister. So due to that, Megami was also involved. But that was not the only thing, as Megami and his team was also involved. So that means Yuji, Nobara, and even Junpei, who had recently joined the team after the whole Goodwill event, had all decided to investigate what was going on, until eventually they go to the Yusahachi Bridge. Now, while they're there, they immediately had to face off against the cursed spirits that are roaming the area, as we see Megami as well as Junpei deciding to face off against a special grade, all the while Nobara and Yuji decide to take care of the two brothers. Now, it's during the fight against the two brothers where we see things play out pretty differently. As you see, using the Sharingan, we see Yuji currently right now avoiding all the attacks the brothers will be throwing at him, and not only at him but also at Nobara, as he'll be making sure to protect Nobara while making sure that she's a safe distance away. Now, another thing is the fact that thanks to Yuji actually having that fire ability that he had recently gotten, which, let's just be honest here, it's a jutsu, but you know how the world is, gonna be calling them curse techniques. Either way, thanks to that new curse technique that Yuji had learned, Yuji had been able to actually continue damaging them while also keeping his distance. As this will go on for quite a while until eventually the brothers realize that they need to retreat, to which they try to do so. But during the time of trying to retreat though, this is when Yuji ends up feeling something click in at that very moment. As when we turn our attention back to their brothers as they were making their getaway, this is when Yuji would then mutter the words, "Cleave." as this will cause said attack to immediately release, as when the brothers were about to get away, this is when their heads would then be cut off, causing them to actually be trapped there along with the sorcerers, all while the people who were driving away just simply ignored all of it, thinking that it didn't involve them, or really not knowing what was going on. But regardless of that, they knew that it was it. This was going to be the end for them. As Yuji ends up looking on surprised by the fact he was able to use the very move that the King of Curses was able to use, he ends up shrugging it off, as right now they had to take care of exercising these curses, as after one last blow, the two brothers would end up passing away, these being Choso's brothers. As now with the two spirits now defeated, we will then see Yuji and Nobara eventually meet up with Megumi and Junpei, who end up revealing that they just defeated a special grade, as after that they end up fleeing the area, so that way they don't actually end up catching the unwanted attention of law authority. But throughout the time as Yuji ends up walking away and leaving the scene, in the back of his mind you could actually end up hearing Sukuna immediately begin to curse and grumble. And the main reason for this was because of the fact that once again, Yuji had done something pretty extraordinary and pretty incredible, but just the simple fact that it's Yuji, he just made it look completely horrible. As Sukuna inside of Yuji's mindscape begins to rant, telling Yuji that he was able to do it way better than Yuji could, all the while Yuji decides to ignore him. As we now do another time skip. As we end up turning to Yuji, as throughout that time of the time skip, he'll be making some drastic improvements in his life of being a Jujutsu sorcerer. Now, throughout that time, Yuji had been taking multiple missions, slaying different curses here and there, collecting quite a bit of money, while at the same time he was getting on actual battle experience and growing stronger. As already, Yuji was finding different ways of using his new fire ability that he's gotten after he awakened his curse technique. And not only that, but he was learning more and more about the Sharingan, as Yuji was already learning a new move for it that he decided to keep secret for now, using it as an ace in the hole for later. And what's crazy about that is the fact that that was not the only thing Yuji was improving on, as throughout that time Yuji was also learning about how to use cleave, as he had been able to practice using the technique multiple times since going out in field and taking on multiple different experiences of taking down curses. And those were only the main things when it comes to Yuji's skill set at the very moment. As we end up turning back to the present time, we eventually end up seeing Yuji as he just returned back after completing another job of exercising curses, as this is when he would then see his team currently talking with Otohime, as she would then inform them that there's a mole in Jujutsu High, as this will cause Yuji to immediately begin to go on the hunt for him, as after getting directions from Mekamaru, they would then find out that Mekamaru was actually the traitor. As the whole event with Mekamaru facing off against Mahito and Geto would go down the same way, with unfortunately Mekamaru dying. As now that they finally finished off Mekamaru and got exactly what they wanted, this is when we would then see Mahito and Geto then prepare for the next move, this being the Shibuya incident. As moving forward with the story, we see the beginning play out pretty similar to the main timeline, as we see Yuji currently on a mission with both Mei and Ui. As throughout that time of just accomplishing the mission, Mei would comment about how impressed she was with Yuji's skill, since Yuji was actually moving and working like a grade 1 sorcerer, even though he's only been a grade 1 sorcerer for a short amount of time. As we end up flashing forward for the next couple of events, this is when suddenly Yuji and his team would then be informed that Gojo had been captured and sealed, which caused them all to be surprised, especially when Yuji is informed that Mahito is involved. As after that, for a brief moment, we begin to see things play out pretty similar to the main timeline, as we see all groups beginning to enter into the battle, as now the full Shibuya incident was about to begin. As the only real difference I'm about to make here is the fact that Junpei in this one is actually going to be assisting Nobara when it comes to taking down that low grade NPC, bro. I'm sorry, that character just pisses me off. He is so annoying. I'm not here to rant about that. I'm here to tell a story. So moving on from that, we now turn to Yuji as he's currently right now making his way over there in order to assist the others. As by the time he ends up arriving there, he'll arrive there just in time to help Megumi when it comes to taking down the other guy. I don't know his name, but basically another NPC that worked for Geto, or Kenjaku. But regardless of who the guy is working for, at the end of the day, the outcome remains the same, with Yuji as well as Megumi defeating the guy, with Yuji in this timeline just assisting him way more since thanks to him actually having curse techniques. As after that, Yuji then runs off into the Shibuya station in order to actually assist when it comes to getting Gojo. But when he ends up rushing down there, this is when he then meets face to face with none other than Choso. And when Choso sees Yuji, he immediately gets pissed off, as he immediately shoots off a blood spear directly at Yuji, with Yuji, thanks to him already having the Sharingan active, dodges out the way just in time, as this is when he then rushes directly towards Choso before landing a punch. Now Choso will be caught off guard by Yuji's speed, but regardless of that, immediately begins to once again use his blood manipulation to give himself a boost of speed and strength. As after that, this is when we then see the two begin to fight off against each other, with Yuji blocking every one of Choso's blows, while also dealing damage back to him. All while Choso will be doing the same thing, as this will actually surprise Yuji by the fact of just how tough Choso really was. As both of them go back into the fight, we see Yuji immediately begin to think of a plan here, as right now he can't really go all out in this current area. As we see Yuji dodge another blow from Choso, this is when he then gets an idea. As after dodging that blow, this is when Yuji would then suddenly end up grabbing Choso's arm and flipping him onto his back. And right as Choso tries to recover, this is when Yuji then charges up his divergent fist before slamming it down on Choso's stomach. As this will cause Choso to actually, nearly fall unconscious from the blow, but at the same time also causes the ground to crack, as they end up falling through the station. As after eventually falling through the station, they finally end up arriving to an open and clear area, or clear enough to where Yuji can finally use one of his techniques without paying for too much of the repercussions. As Choso ends up getting up and staring down at Yuji with anger, this is when Yuji will then look at Choso before suddenly apologizing, as he tells Choso that he simply does not have the time. As Choso tries to use another piercing blood at Yuji, this is when Yuji would then respond by releasing a ginormous spiraling flame wave directly at Choso, burning through the piercing blood surprisingly, and also causing Choso to get hit pretty badly by the attack, as he ends up collapsing down onto the ground, as he ends up losing the fight against Yuji. As now with Choso now defeated, this is where we then see Yuji preparing to help the others with the rest of Shibuya, but right as he was about to do so, this is when he would then be stopped by none other than Haniko and Mimiko. As they end up looking at Yuji surprised that he was even awake, but still regardless, this is when they then begin to ask him as Sukuna's vessel to help them with a situation. As this is when they then informed him about the whole situation that happened with Geto and Kenjaku. As after explaining all this to Yuji, this is when they then give Yuji Sukuna's finger. As they end up explaining to him that in exchange for this finger, that he was supposed to help them. To which Yuji ends up agreeing to it, but not for the reasons that they were expecting. As Yuji explains that he's only agreeing because of the fact that they show how much they care for Geto. So due to that, Yuji was more than willing to help. As this will cause both Haniko and Mimiko to actually blush at this, but before they can actually continue talking, this is when suddenly Jogo would then arrive, as he begins questioning about what exactly was going on, and especially asking the girls how many fingers have they given Yuji. Now after not getting a response at the time that he wanted, this is when Jogo then tries to attack them, but when he does, this is when Yuji then interferes, as he ends up getting both of them to safety. Now Jogo would actually be surprised by the fact that Yuji is still conscious, but this is when he then tells Yuji to surrender without any difficulty. But this is when Yuji then declines as he stares down coldly at Jogo. Now Jogo immediately gets annoyed by Yuji's stubbornness, as this is when he then rushes towards Yuji trying to knock him out, but Yuji ends up dodging out of the way just in time thanks to the Sharingan being active. As just like that, this is when we then get a fight between Jogo and Yuji. As both of them immediately begin to clash with each other, with Jogo actually being surprised that Yuji was actually able to put up much more of a fight than he expected, since after the report from Mahito, he just simply thought that Yuji was on a slightly stronger version of Mahito at the current moment. But still, Mahito was still young, so that means that he wasn't nearly at the level of Jogo just yet. But still, regardless of that, we will see Jogo continue facing off against Yuji, with Jogo actually being surprised by the fact that Yuji was dealing him some pretty huge damage, as every single one of Yuji's blows will actually cause Jogo to actually fall into a little bit of a daze after each one. As you see Yuji end up kicking Jogo away, this is when Jogo immediately ends up shrugging off the blow before grabbing Yuji by the neck and suddenly bringing him up above the station of Shibuya. As Yuji would then be tossed up into the air by Jogo, as he will end up actually free falling from the sky, this is when Yuji immediately begins to act. As already thinking of multiple different strategies in his mind, this is when Yuji then begins to actually power up his divergent fist, but then channels the energy into his feet. As Yuji ends up landing on the ground, this is when he actually ends up getting a boost from this. As thanks to him actually combining the divergent fist and using it as a movement technique instead of a physical one, this allowed Yuji to immediately get the speed that he needs to keep up with Jogo. As even though Jogo was literally flying up in the air, Yuji was still able to keep up with him. As Yuji is continuously fighting off against Jogo, Jogo would get increasingly annoyed until eventually he has enough. As after finally reaching a certain point in the fight, this is when Jogo then releases his domain expansion, trapping Yuji inside as he will be inside of Jogo's domain. As Jogo looks at Yuji one last time before telling him that he gets one last chance to surrender or else. As Yuji will be silent for a moment not responding, Jogo was about to actually take the initiative to activate his attack, but this is when, to his surprise, Yuji ends up getting into a crouching stance before suddenly activating a simple domain. Yes, throughout the time of training, throughout the entire time skip, Yuji had actually learned one of the skills of being a sorcerer, this being simple domain, as he actually learned it from Todo. As thanks to Todo having a high IQ, he had actually been able to teach Yuji relatively easily, with Yuji being able to pick up on it pretty easily as well. As thanks to this, Yuji was actually able to dodge out of the way of the sure hit effect of Jogo's domain, surprising the cursed spirits. But right now, this still led to another complicated issue, this being how to get out of the domain. As it wasn't like Mahito's domain where Sukuna's soul can just simply interfere in this. No, Yuji was now on his own on this one. As he continues dodging out of the way of the attacks that were there, this is when Yuji then has an idea. Although it was still risky, it was the only way right now. As now with a determined look, we see Yuji once again dodge another one of Jogo's attacks, as Jogo begins to power up another big one, as he thinks that this one is going to be the one to hit Yuji, while at the same time, he's going to make sure to at least lower it down enough to the point where it doesn't kill Yuji, as after all, they're still going to need Sukuna's vessel. But right before he does release the attack, this is when suddenly he ends up looking on in confusion, as Yuji's eyes will then change its patterns, as we see the three Tamori Sharingan then transform into the Mangekyo, as Yuji would then scream out, Kamui. As this is when we would then see Jogo's body, except for his head, then get warped away, as Jogo will be left on in shock. As this attack, as well as whatever just happened right there, actually caused the entirety of Jogo's domain to actually slowly fall apart. As Jogo will be there looking on in complete shock about what just happened, this is when he then sees Yuji appear right in front of him. But this time, Yuji was using a new technique. Taking inspiration from Choso, this is when we then see Yuji creating a small ball of fire into his hands before suddenly aiming it directly at Jogo. As this is when Yuji then releases Piercing Flame, as we would see the flaming arrow end up piercing through Jogo's head, as the cursed spirit just looks on in complete shock as he begins to completely disintegrate, as he was successfully exorcised by Yuji. As Yuji ends up looking on at what he just did, this is when he then ends up collapsing down to the ground, as by this point Yuji is feeling exhaustion. By this point, his Sharingan has been active for a very long time now. Not only that, but he just had to use a technique that Yuji was still learning on how to use it, this being the Kamui. And to make it even worse is the simple fact that Yuji by this point had just fought against not one, but two powerful opponents and took some pretty massive damage from the both of them. As even with all that though, Yuji was still standing, and not only that, but he still had more work to do. As even though his body was not looking the very best right now, Yuji decided to continue on helping, as he immediately dashes off, but not before taking the fingers that Jogo had on him, as after all, he still is going to need this for later. As now moving on from this, we can now do a change of scenes. Now turning to Nanami for a few minutes, we actually see him finally finishing off a bunch of curses at the Shibuya station, but as he does, this is when he then sees himself currently at the mercy of Mahito. As Mahito then tells Nanami that it's been fun, but it's now finally time to get rid of him. This is when, to Mahito's absolute surprise, his arm would then be cut off, as he ends up looking at it in complete shock before suddenly he would then be punched in the face by none other than Yuji, as Yuji had just arrived at the nick of time. As Yuji would arrive there though, you can already see that he was suffering from a little bit of exhaustion, not even a little bit, like a lot of it, but even then he was still willing to fight. As Yuji takes a good look at Nanami's condition, he ends up cursing considering the fact of how bad Nanami was doing right now, but if they're just able to get him to Shoko just in time, then maybe, just maybe, he may have a chance to survive. So with that thought in mind, Yuji would tell Nanami to stay behind while he faces off against Mahito. As we soon see Mahito getting up from the injuries that he had sustained from earlier, this is when he then rushes at Yuji and more precisely was trying to rush at Nanami in order to kill him off, but Yuji actually ends up preventing him. As this is where we then get the battle between Yuji versus Mahito. As Mahito continues trying to fight off against Yuji, he would then be completely surprised by the fact that Yuji is still able to actually put the works on him. As Yuji, even though he was injured and even though he was suffering from exhaustion, he was still beating Mahito up. As thanks to all the training he has gone from Gojo and Sukuna, and not only that, but thanks to him actually taking a moment in his Jujutsu sorcerer life to actually take things productively, this caused Yuji to be way much more of a threat to Mahito than he ever expected. As Yuji was putting the works on him, using cleave to cut off Mahito before he actually reaches Nanami, and not only that, but also landing more fatal blows on Mahito to the point where he has no choice but to retreat for a moment, as he begins running throughout the station of Shibuya. Now Yuji would chase after him, not letting him a chance to escape, and not only that, but he begins to use his divergent fist and kind of use it all over his body as a way to gain momentum, as he uses it as a movement technique. As Yuji would end up be bouncing all over the places of Shibuya Station, he eventually ends up encountering Mahito once again, but Mahito this time was actually rushing towards Nobara, as he was trying to do the same thing he did in the main timeline. But as he was making his way to Nobara though, this is when Yuji would then scream out, "Dismantle." As this is when suddenly we would then see Mahito then get completely diced up by Yuji, as Mahito ends up looking on in complete shock, all the while Nobara just looks on at the scene with a dazed expression. As now that Yuji had taken care of Mahito temporarily, this is when he would then rush over to Nobara, asking her to help out with Nanami, considering the fact that he was in critical condition. With Nobara doing so immediately, but telling Yuji that he has to come back alive, with Yuji saying that he was planning on it. As after that, Yuji would then begin to rush out to the area as he knew that that was not the end of Mahito. And just as he expected, he was right, as Mahito had been revealed that the one that he killed off was actually a clone of Mahito, as the real Mahito was still out there. And speaking of Mahito, he begins to make challenges even more difficult for Yuji as he creates more transfigured humans to attack him, as Yuji will be using this mantle and cleave to cut through every last one of them, even using his fire style to immediately burn them to ash as he tries to get to Mahito. As Mahito would continue rushing off and facing off against Yuji, this is when suddenly he would then be surprised as Todo would then enter the area as he uses the Boogie Woogie technique to actually make Mahito appear right in front of Yuji, as Yuji ends up landing him with a black flash, causing the cursed spirit to take heavy damage and cause him to be sent flying. As Todo had now arrived, this is when he and Yuji then begin to put in that work against Mahito, as Mahito begins quickly overwhelmed by the duo. But eventually though, after getting hit so many times, finally Mahito decides that he had enough, as is when Mahito then decides to activate his domain expansion. Now luckily both Todo and Yuji are able to avoid this thanks to them having a simple domain. But when it does happen, this is when Mahito then decides to use this as an opportunity to distract Todo, as by this point, he already saw that Todo was much more of a threat at the very moment, considering the fact he was giving Yuji too many openings. So he decides to rush to Todo and actually tries to make Todo, chop off his arm. But when he was about to do so though, Yuji seeing this immediately actually called to action, as this is when Yuji then releases another variation of his fire style, this being the Dragon Flame Bomb. As we see the dragon-shaped flames then be shot out directly from Yuji's mouth, as there will be a total of 5 of them, and every single one of them will then rush directly towards Mahito like a seeking missile. As Mahito will end up getting hit by these flames, taking some major damage as he ends up cursing once again. As now realizing that he was now back up against the corner, this is when he then decides to tap into his ultimate mode, stating that it was going to be all or nothing at this very moment. As this is when he will then transform truly into his special grade mode. And when he does, he immediately begins to show the difference in power as he uses this form to immediately appear right in front of Todo and land him with a powerful blow. A blow that causes Todo to be put out the fight for a few moments. But when he does though, this is when suddenly he'll then turn to be face to face with none other than Yuji, who punches Mahito, but the blow doesn't seem to affect him too much, thanks to the extra durability that he's gotten because of this transformation. As now with that, we will then see Yuji and Mahito then once again get back into combat with each other, as Yuji and Mahito will be continuously fighting against each other, trading blows and everything, as Yuji will be reaching his limit by this point. As by this point, Yuji has been exhausted. He has now fought a total of 3 special grades by this point right now, and to make it even worse, he has sustained damage from every last one of these fights. And to make it even worse now is the fact that now he's facing off against said special grade that has gotten an extra buff. So already, Yuji was getting pushed to his limit right now, but for some odd reason, he was still doing incredibly good against Mahito. As Mahito and Yuji continue facing off against each other, eventually Yuji's blows actually begin to cause the cursed spirit some damage. As after a while just simply going back and forth, eventually it was finally time to settle it, with one last punch. As just as Mahito and Yuji were about to finally decide to fight with one last blow, this is when Yuji ends up deciding to do something. Although it was risky and he still does not know the full aspect of this technique, he decided to do so. As just as Mahito was about to land a blow on Yuji, finally finishing off the fight, he would then be surprised as he ends up being the first one to come into contact with Yuji, but is surprised to see that his arm just phases right through Yuji at that very moment. As Mahito ends up looking on complete shock, this is when he then looks at Yuji's eyes, only to see that Yuji had once again activated the Kamui. As this is when Yuji would then end up releasing another black flash, hitting Mahito square in the chest and causing the cursed spirit to immediately be flung out of his transformation. As we end up seeing Mahito once again, but this time being the shell of his former self, as Mahito will be on the ground, literally sniveling up and trying his best to retain that power that he once had, only to fail miserably, as now he was at the mercy of Yuji Itadori. As Mahito ends up looking around in complete terror before looking at Yuji, as he then tried to run away, this is when Yuji without any hesitation would then use Cleave, cutting up Mahito's legs and preventing him from escaping. As Mahito would begin crawling on the ground before begging Yuji to spare him, Yuji would just look at Mahito with disgust, remembering all the awful things the spirit had done, all the transfigured humans, what he did to Junpei's mother, everything, as Yuji told this cursed spirit that he doesn't deserve mercy. As with those final words to Mahito, this is when Yuji would then immediately begin to release a ginormous fireball upon the cursed spirit, burning it and preventing it from ever coming back, as Yuji would end up burning Mahito until there was nothing left. As now, with Mahito now defeated, we can now see Yuji finally end up getting a small moment to rest as he ends up collapsing down to the ground in order to get a small breather. I mean, throughout this entire arc, Yuji has been putting in that work and effort. He had to take down 3 special grades by himself, a 1v1. Sure, Todo helped him out when it came to Maito, but no one helped him when it came to Choso as well as Jogo. So yeah, Yuji was literally fighting for his life. But finally, after doing so much, he can get a moment to breathe. Or so he thought, as this is when Geto would then make his appearance known. Now, when Yuji ends up looking at Geto, at first he's confused until Geto ends up revealing his name, as this will cause Yuji to immediately get a serious expression before telling Geto that he knows that he's an imposter, a fraud. And this is when Geto, after hearing this, begins to chuckle, telling Yuji that he was impressed about that, even telling Yuji that he was impressed about the whole event when it came to Jogo, when it came to Maito, and even when it came to Choso, telling Yuji that he actually surpassed many of his expectations, but also telling Yuji that it was finally time for a new era to set in. But before Yuji can get to asking, this is when then Geto would then release a cursed spirit, sending it to sick on Yuji. And Yuji, seeing this, would immediately curse as he tries to move out the way, only to be frozen solid thanks to Urami, as he was right there watching Yuji, as he tells Yuji that he was unworthy of being Sukuna's vessel. As Yuji ends up cursing at this, as he was about to get hit by the attack from Geto, this is when suddenly, thanks to Todo, Yuji would then be swapped out of place with Urami, as he's the one who actually ends up getting hit by the attack. As this will be due to Todo, as thanks to him now losing an arm in the fight against Maito, he had been able to actually assist Yuji when it comes to facing off against Geto and Urami. As we would end up seeing Yuji thanking Todo for the save, as this is when the rest of them would then end up arriving as they all prepared to jump Geto as well as Urami. As this is where we then see similar events end up taking place with all the students banding together as they all try their best efforts to stop them, but unfortunately Urami and Geto just proved to be much stronger. But you see, the thing is, Urami will be having a tough time as Yuji, even though he's exhausted, will still keep on going. Even though he was almost at his limits, he was still enough to actually help out, as thanks to his fire jutsus, he was actually able to burn away Urami's eyes, causing him to be increasingly annoyed. And when Choso entered the mix, talking about how Yuji is his brother and everything, the both of them were actually able to put Urami in a tight position. As this will go on for quite a while until eventually Yuki will end up arriving just in time, as this will cause Geto to realize that they need to retreat, as he ends up saying farewell as well as trying to show off the prison realm where they're holding Gojo. But just as they were doing this though, Yuji in that split instant, after seeing an opening, would then end up releasing a cleave. As just as Kenjaku was about to get away, this is when he would then see that his hand had actually been chopped up, and he'll be even more surprised to see that now the prison realm was out of his grasp. As he ended up getting caught off guard by the attack, as Yuji ends up using the very last bit of his energy to suddenly end up boost over to Gojo's prison realm, as he ends up grabbing it at the very last instance before Urami or Geto can even get a chance. As Geto ends up cursing, he begins to release a bunch of swarms of cursed spirits before announcing that he's going to bring this new era of Jujutsu sorcerers back into the Heian era, as this is when a bunch of cursed spirits would then swarm the city. As we end up seeing Yuji still having a hold on the prison realm, he ends up smiling since at least he stopped them from getting away with Gojo. But unfortunately right now, that was as much as Yuji can do at the moment, as he ends up falling to unconsciousness just as he lands on the ground, as he sees the others rushing towards him. As this is where we now do another time skip. Well, so I'm going to have to give a short intermission here. So if you guys are anime watchers and have just purely been focusing on the anime of JJK, then I do have to give you guys a recommendation as well as a warning that you guys should actually stop watching the video at this point, as the next segment of this video is going to mostly get into manga spoilers. So if you guys don't want to get spoiled too much, I don't recommend you guys actually watch this part of the video. And just to be sure my message is clear, once again, if you guys do not want to get spoiled, then stop at this part of the video. But if you guys do not care about that or have already read the manga, then let's continue on. As cutting back to the present, we end up seeing Yuji once again, but by this point, he has awakened. And when he does, he ends up getting informed about the whole situation thanks to Yuki, as she informs Yuji about the fact that number one, thanks to Yuji getting the prison realm from Geto, this allowed them the opportunity to actually try to get Gojo out the prison realm. Although it was definitely going to take a while, mostly because of the fact that no one really knows completely about the full capabilities of the prison realm, as they don't know exactly how to unlock it. But luckily, now that they actually have it, they can at least attempt to do so. And that was not the only thing, as after Kenjaku and Urami had made their escape, all the cursed spirits had been released throughout the entire city, causing all the sorcerers there to immediately get into action. But unfortunately, the ones that were way too injured, they needed to be escorted out the area. So that means half their forces were dedicated into saving their current allies and making sure they get to Shoko safely, while the other half was there taking care of the curses. As Yuji, now finally caught up on the whole situation, would hear all this, would immediately end up getting up as he then heads off to actually help out when it comes to taking care of the curses. Although Yuki asks Yuji if he really can continue doing so in his condition, Yuji was stubborn as he tells them that most definitely. As after all, after falling into unconsciousness, Yuji got the much needed rest that he needed to, at least enough to the point where he can at least take care of these curses. And the one who's going to be assisting Yuji in this one would actually be Choso as well, as just like in the main timeline, Choso is going to be there to assist Yuji, as he ends up telling Yuji that he's an ally, or better yet, that he's his brother. To which Yuji was of course confused by the whole situation, but still regardless of that was still grateful for Choso's help. As after that, for quite a while, the two of them would just simply be there taking out curses left and right, but while doing so, this is when suddenly we would then see the appearance of Naoya. As by this point, Naoya had decided to actually go out there to kill Yuji as well as Megumi, after finding out that Megumi was going to become the next head of the clan after Naruto had died, which in Naoya's eyes, that just seemed completely unfair. And to make things even worse is the fact that arriving on the scene would be none other than Yuta Kotsu, as just like in the main timeline, Yuta had been informed by the higher ups to actually go out there to kill Yuji, even forming a bounty vow with him in order to make sure that he fulfills the promise. As Yuta ends up appearing right there, Yuji as well as Choso end up taking in the aura that he was just wielding, as it was similar to that of Gojo. As this is when Choso would then immediately get into action as he begins attacking the two sorcerers while telling Yuji to run. Now Yuji ends up declining this as he still has enough strength to keep on fighting, and this is when he would then be actually surprised as Yuta would actually end up appearing right in front of Yuji, as it wasn't for the fact that he had the Sharingan at that very moment, he would have lost, as Yuji ended up dodging a swing from Yuta's sword. Now Yuta ends up commenting that he was actually impressed by Yuji at that very moment, but this is when the two of them would then begin to fight against each other, all the while Choso will face off against Naoya. As this is where we now turn to the fight between Yuta and Yuji. Now we see Yuji currently right now facing off against Yuta, as both of them will be exchanging blows. Now Yuta would comment how impressed he was with Yuji's strength at the very moment, since by this point right now Yuji should be completely exhausted, and not only that but he seemed to be heavily injured, but even with all of that Yuji was still fighting, and was actually putting up quite a bit of a fight. As Yuta continues commenting this is when he would then actually end up getting a cut on his cheek, as he couldn't believe that Yuji had actually been able to hurt him at this very moment. As Yuji had to just use cleave at that very moment, but then he ends up shouting out dismantle. As Yuta is now forced to dodge out of the way, just as the entire path that he once was in would be completely diced up to nothing. As Yuji would actually be impressed by this, mostly because of the fact of how fast Yuta is, this is when he would then be forced to actually dodge out of the way from Yuta's sword slash, as Yuta seemingly was about to completely cut Yuji in half. As Yuji ends up flipping over, this is when once again both of them then continue fighting off against each other, with both of them doing damage to each other, with Yuji using cleave and dismantle to get a few licks in on Yuta, all the while Yuta would respond using his katana to get a few cuts on Yuji. As this back and forth will continue on for quite a while until eventually Yuji ends up releasing a cleave on Yuta's sword, causing it to actually be destroyed. Now Yuta ends up looking down pretty upset about the fact that his sword was destroyed, as this is when he then realizes that Yuji was going to be quite problematic and way more troublesome. As this is when Yuji ends up seeing the opportunity and releases a blast wave wild dance, as the spiraling wave of flames will then rush over at Yuta as he just calmly stares at it as he seemingly gets hit by the attack, as everything that was inside the flaming spiral will be burned to nothing. As Yuji ends up looking at the scene with a calm expression, thinking that he finally was able to stop it, but also feeling quite sad about what happened to Yuta. But this is when suddenly Yuta's voice would then ring out, as Yuji was confused until suddenly he would then be grabbed a hold of by none other than Rika, as Yuta ends up telling Rika to hold Yuji down. As Yuji ends up taking in the scene, just being completely caught off guard at the moment, this is when he would then see Yuta rushing at him with the broken katana, as he eventually ends up stabbing Yuji directly in the heart, as Yuji ends up taking in the scene with a look of complete shock, not being able to believe it. As this is when Yuji ends up cursing one last time before falling into unconsciousness, as just like that, Yuji Itadori had been supposedly killed by Yuta Kotsu. Now after this, eventually we see things play out pretty similarly, as Yuta ends up dragging Yuji's dead body back to Choso, as Choso ends up looking at the scene in complete shock, but before he can do anything, this is when he would then be knocked out by Yuta. As Yuta ends up looking at Naoya, he ends up commenting about the fact of just how beaten up Naoya looks like, before telling Naoya that since he saved him from Choso, that Naoya has to do him a favor, as Naoya would have no choice but to report back to the higher ups stating that Yuji Itadori had been killed off. As now with that finished, we can now do another time skip. So we now time skip to when Yuji eventually ends up waking up, and when Yuji wakes up, the very first thing he sees is Yuta, as he was currently right now sitting there waiting for Yuji. Now after seeing that Yuji was awake, Yuta was really happy considering the fact he didn't think that the whole trick was gonna work, but luckily it did as he begins to explain the whole situation to Yuji. And after hearing this, you would expect Yuji to actually show any type of emotion to it, but Yuji by this point is just completely done by everything. Like at this point he just feels kind of meh about the whole thing. As by this point, Yuji has dealt with so much stuff by this point that he begins to really feel kind of a disconnection to everything. As right now, they still had more important tasks to deal with, as this is when Yuji would then ask Yuta about what exactly their plans are for Geto. And this is when suddenly Megumi then enters the scene as he begins to discuss everything, about the culling games and more importantly about the fact that his sister was caught up in it, as he would ask Yuji for help. And when Yuji heard this, he just sighs before immediately activating the Sharingan as he looks directly at Megami's eyes before telling him just tell him when they need to do it. Now when Yuji says this, he will see that both Yuta and Megami would actually be silent as he would ask them what was wrong, until suddenly this is when Yuta would then pick up a broken shard of glass as he then shows Yuji what exactly they were seeing. As Yuji's eyes had shifted from the normal 3 Tamori Sharingan as it now was the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. As Yuji ends up looking at it with a complete shocked expression before sighing, as by this point he's not even surprised anymore, and in fact this was a blessing as whatever this thing might have given him, he's gonna need it for the next upcoming events. As now with that, this is where we then do another time skip. As throughout this time skip, we're not going to see many events be that important as it was mostly preparation for the Culling Games. Although if I would say there was one big difference here, it would be the simple fact of how exactly they convinced Hikari. As throughout the time when they end up going to the Fight Club and soon end up encountering Hikari, when it was finally time for Yuji and Hikari to actually discuss things will play out pretty differently. As the rest of the group will wait outside, waiting for Yuji to come out there, showing or explaining to them exactly what went down, this is when, to their surprise, busting through the door, they would then see Hikari actually falling to the ground, as he would have a bleeding nose, while at the same time, he would have a look of respect, yet anger, as he would look at Yuji directly, which by this point, Yuji was just so dumb of this entire situation, as he would be staring down at Hikari with his EMS activated with an annoyed expression. As he tells Hikari whether he's in or he's not. Now Hikari looks at Yuji with, of course, a look of respect, as he would get up before saying that he will under certain conditions, as he would ask for his Fight Club to be legal. And this is when Megami, being the head of the Zenin clan, would then say that he would actually assist with this, not knowing about the fact that the Zenin clan is no more, thanks to Maki, killing them all in a single day. But that was something to worry about another time, as right now they already had the entire team formed, and that was good enough. As now with that, the entire team has been completely formed, as they end up returning back to Yuki to explain the whole situation, only for them to be surprised about who exactly they come across. As currently right now sitting down there peacefully while sipping on some tea will be none other than Gojo, as he just simply waves at them, putting on a very simple face, acting as if he just hadn't been sealed throughout this entire time, as everyone just begins looking at him in complete shock before rushing over. As this is where I have to give a quick summary about what had occurred. Now, throughout the time that the entire group has been gathering their forces and gathering power for the Culling Games, Yuki had actually found out a way to release Gojo from the prison realm, this being due to the fact that they talked with Master Tengen. As just like in the main timeline, he explained about how exactly to release Gojo, and due to this, they immediately were able to do so. Now, Gojo throughout this entire time, instead of immediately rushing to battle and everything, he did the most simple thing and just simply waited for them to return back. And that's exactly how they got into this very situation. Now, after finding out that Gojo was, of course, okay and everything, and that he was finally free, the rest of them begin to finally calm down, as they think that things are finally going to go their way. But this is when Gojo then reveals that the situation is now going to be even more complicated, since they still have to deal with everything in the Culling Games, and not only that, but they also have to go after Kenjaku, as now they know who exactly is behind it. As this is when Gojo then begins to discuss his plan, as basically he's going to be the one to confront Kenjaku, since obviously he was the strongest, and the quicker they get Kenjaku out the way, the better. While the rest of them, they are here to actually fight against the other opponents that are going to be resurrected because of the Culling Games, and also because of Kenjaku. As after explaining all this to the group, they immediately understand the plan, as with that, this is where we then get into the Culling Games. As entering the Culling Games, we see things play out immediately, as we see Gojo then decide to dash off to the location where Kenjaku is, although the rest of them decide to put in work. And Yuji, being one of them, would immediately do the same thing, as he will be there taking enemies down left and right, until eventually, after going through a horde of enemies, he eventually ends up finding Higuruma. Now, when Yuji encounters Higuruma, at first he thought of just simply leaving the man alone. But this is when, after trying to leave the man alone, Yuji would then be reminded of something that he had been actually told to do by Megami. This being the fact that Megami had actually asked Yuji to actually find Higuruma, since with Higuruma currently having one of the highest points, this being 100, that means that Higuruma has a chance to actually add an additional rule. And that means he can stop the forced killing rule. Now, when Yuji remembered this, he immediately turned back to Higuruma before asking him if he could help. Now, Higuruma just responds in a very similar fashion as he does in the main timeline, as him and Yuji would then go back and forth, until eventually Higuruma had enough, as he then ends up getting up, as he turns to Yuji, before stating that currently right now it seems as if they can't reach an agreement, and they're gonna have to solve that. As Yuji, already understanding that was an intention to fight, he then gets into a fighting stance, already activating his EMS, but this is when Higuruma then immediately, right out of the gate, activates his domain expansion, trapping Yuji right inside of it. As Yuji would be there, he immediately tries his best to reach over to Higuruma, but this is when he would then be brushed off by the Judge Man, as basically it was an old domain, so that means Yuji has to follow its rules. So due to that, Yuji will now be placed on trial, as Yuji will be accused of many shady acts and things that paint him in a bad light. Now he immediately tries to deny it, stating that he never did it, but whatever point he brings up, Higuruma will shut it down every single time. As eventually it will be finally time for the Judge Man to finally cast a verdict on Yuji. As Yuji will be silent for a moment before suddenly he ends up looking up directly at Higuruma, staring him down in the eyes with his EMS still activated. As this is when Yuji then sighs, telling them to just shut up and declare that he's guilty. As this is when the judge immediately begins to scream that Yuji was guilty. But right before he was able to complete that though, this is when Yuji then immediately ends up bringing up a hand sign. As this is when Yuji would then state the words, "Domain expansion." Now hearing these words, Higuruma's eyes would then go wide, as this is when suddenly the entirety of Higuruma's domain would then be overpowered by Yuji's, as the courtroom was then completely obliterated as they were transferred over to a new area, as he would then hear Yuji thanking him. You see, throughout this time, as Yuji was having that little back and forth between Higuruma, Yuji was actually trying to find a way to get out of this domain. He already tried using simple domain in the situation, but while it did work on Yuji, it didn't work exactly on Higuruma. So that means that basically Yuji would just be trapped here until he followed the rules regardless. So that means that Yuji had to find out another way. And luckily he did. This being the fact that Yuji had been able to actually learn this from Gojo, as throughout the earlier times of him learning to be a sorcerer, he knew that there was only a few ways to get out of a domain expansion. Either A, having a simple domain, or B, overpowering the original domain. And that's exactly what Yuji had accomplished. Although he still hasn't mastered it, and he so far has not practiced it at all, Yuji was still able to pull it off, although to a certain extent, as Yuji had finally been able to do a domain expansion. As Higuruma ends up looking at Yuji's domain, as he'll be kind of put off by just how terrible the reversal world is, as it looks similar to his world, except by this point it was a dry wasteland. The entire cities were completely on a black blaze, and to make it even worse was the fact that the sun was just humid. But just as he was thinking of the sun, this is when he would then be forced to look up, and when he does, he sees something that will be surprising. As instead of seeing the sun, all he will see is the eye of the Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. As he ends up looking at it with a shocked expression as he feels himself burning up, as he ends up turning to Yuji, only to see Yuji just simply standing there, thanking Higuruma for this experience. As now that Yuji had Higuruma trapped in his domain, this is when Yuji would then ask once again if Higuruma will help them. Now when Higuruma stays silent for a couple months before asking Yuji, even if he were to help him, what exactly is Yuji trying to accomplish here? As this will cause Yuji to then reveal exactly what his true intentions are, this being what exactly is his goal beyond all of this. And it's just a simple fact that Yuji wants to help out everyone, as that's literally was the entire point of being a Jujutsu sorcerer. Yuji wanted to help people, like his grandfather once told him. And when Higuruma heard this, he'll be kind of surprised by the fact of just kind of how simple yet completely foolish intentions that Yuji had. As he looks at Yuji for a solid moment before sighing, as he didn't ask Yuji if he really had a choice in the matter at the very moment, since by this point Yuji at any moment can just simply end up killing him if Higuruma decides not to agree. Now Yuji shrugs as he tells Higuruma that he's not really willing to do so, as at the end of the day it's still Higuruma's decision. And after hearing this, Higuruma lets out a chuckle as he couldn't believe just how much of a bullshit way Yuji was doing things, but ultimately he decides to agree. As with that, Higuruma ends up finally being released from Yuji's domain, as the entire domain ended up collapsing since Yuji still had not mastered it, but still it was good enough. As now with that, this is when Higuruma then decides to use his points, as while he could not get rid of the forced killing rule since, Kenjaku already had a plan for that, what he did do is add a new rule stating that you can transfer points. As now that was taken care of, we would then see Yuji and Higuruma go their separate ways for a small moment, as both of them decides to actually take care of the current task at hand. As right now, Yuji was taking care of multiple different people that were a part of the culling games, trying his best to rack up as many points as possible to bring an end to it. As after a few moments have passed of just simply facing off against different variations of enemies, this is when Yuji would then regroup with Megami and the others as they begin to discuss about what was going on. As apparently finally the culling games were about to come to an end soon, as Gojo was nearing finishing up with the task. But as this was going on though, finally, after waiting his time patiently. After seeing Yuji fumble about, continuing enjoying his pathetic life, going around just continue existing as a flaw, an abomination, it was finally time for the King of Curses to make his grand return. As this is when Sukuna would then actually mutter in Yuji's ear that it was finally time for Yuji to make good on that promise. As this is when, just as Sukuna ends up saying the words, Yuji ends up offering full control over the King of Curses, as the King of Curses then decides to make his move. As this is when Sukuna would immediately end up breaking one of Yuji's fingers before forcing Megami to eat it, as this is when he then does the transfer. As Yuji ends up snapping back into consciousness, and when he does, he ends up seeing Sukuna, now currently right now, being in the form of Megami. As Yuji ends up looking at it with a complete shocked look, this is when suddenly he would then be caught off guard by the fact he ends up getting punched in the stomach and blown away as he ends up slamming into a building. As Sukuna ends up laughing at the display that he had just made, this is when he then reminds Yuji exactly what he promised. As after that, this is when he would then end up seeing Angel approaching, as she was of course aggravated by the fact that that Megami was of course taken from her, as he tries to actually kill Sukuna. But just like in the main timeline, Sukuna pulls his bullshit and supposedly ends up killing Angel. Now when Yuji ends up seeing this, he snaps. As while Sukuna was laughing about what he did to Angel, this is when he then turns to Yuji only to be surprised, as this is when he would then be stabbed in the shoulder by a flaming spear. As Yuji ends up using that opportunity, as Sukuna could not move that arm any longer for a temporary amount of time, as he rushes over to Sukuna before landing him with a powerful right, causing the King of Curses to be sent flying. Now Sukuna ends up cursing at this, as he ends up using reverse curse energy to recover, as he ends up sending a dismantle at Yuji, with Yuji doing the same thing, as both of them end up clashing at the same time. Now this will further annoy Sukuna, considering the fact that both of their attacks are of equal level. And remind you, this is Sukuna when he's already at 15 fingers. As yes, throughout the time of preparation for the Culling Games, Yuji did consume the fingers that Joko had on him. But still, regardless of that, Sukuna gets pretty annoyed by the fact, as he and Yuji would then continue fighting against each other. But throughout the time of fighting Yuji, this is when suddenly Maki would also intervene as well, as now it was a 2v1. And Sukuna was honestly getting pretty cooked up by the two, since Yuji was even more aggravated, not only that but way more powerful, and Maki was just Maki. So yeah, definitely a power duo. As both of them continue on with their onslaught on Sukuna, eventually Sukuna does make his getaway thanks to Urami, as they had been narrowly stopped by Yuji, as he had sent a ginormous dragon flame bomb that almost hit them, if it wasn't for the fact that Urami had intervened just at the last moment, but even Urami had taken damage from it. As Sukuna ends up cursing at Yuji, telling him that he's once again pathetic, a flaw, and an abomination, as he would then go off already planning for the next events that are about to occur. As after this, soon afterwards, the entire group ends up regrouping, as this is when Gojo would then make his appearance known, as the appearance of the strongest immediately caused all of them to calm down. As now that Gojo had finally arrived, this is when Gojo would then ask in the most serious tone about what exactly is the situation, with Yuji explaining that Sukuna had been released. Now when Gojo heard this, he immediately sighed as he scratched the back of his head before explaining that this was an extremely bad situation they're in, as this is when he then reveals that Kenjaku had narrowly escaped Gojo. As throughout the time of him fighting against Kenjaku, Gojo had put the works on the guy, literally nearly killing the man, and he most definitely would have if it wasn't for the fact that Kenjaku had a plan, as he created a failsafe just in case he would have nearly died, as this had allowed Kenjaku to get away during the time of him fighting off against Gojo. As after hearing this will cause everyone to immediately look down as they realize just the situation they're in, as this is when Gojo sighs as he then explains that he's going to have to make the situation very clear to them then. As time skipping forward a little bit, this is when we would then see Kenjaku as well as Sukuna, as they're currently right now just talking about their next moves. But as this was happening though, this is when suddenly Gojo ends up appearing. Now when Gojo ends up arriving, this causes both of them to tense up a little bit. Well, Kenjaku and Urami. Sukuna does not sweat at all as he looks at the so-called strongest of the current era with a smirk. As now that Gojo had finally arrived, this is when he then begins to release a pressure, pretty much explaining here that since he was the one being challenged here, and thanks to him being the strongest, he was the one who makes the rules. As he looks at all of them directly in the eyes before smirking, saying that in 1 month that he will fight Sukuna, and not only that, but he also claims that he will kill both Sukuna and Kenjaku. As both of them say nothing more but agree to the terms, as after that, Gojo ends up teleporting away, as this is where we then have a time skip. Turning to the very day of the event, we see everyone currently right now tensed up, as we see Gojo in his new attire now preparing to face off against, well, Sukuna. As everyone was there, already discussing the plan one last time and everything, Gojo was right about to head off as he tells everyone to wish him luck, with no one really saying anything since why does he need luck? He's the strongest. As Gojo ends up smirking, this is when he then continues walking until eventually he then stops. Now everyone will look at Gojo confused until suddenly Gojo ends up tapping on a domain. Now this will be an innate domain but still a domain nonetheless, as when Gojo ends up tapping it, he sees that even he himself cannot enter it. Now he ends up looking at the scene with a serious expression as everyone else would then panic, thinking that Kenjaku or Sukuna had gone back on their deals or their agreements. But this is when Gojo would then smile. So you finally decide to be selfish for once, haven't you? Itadori Yuji. As after saying these words, everyone ends up quieting down as they end up looking around only to see that Yuji was not among them, as it finally all made sense. Currently right now inside the domain, we see Sukuna just staring down at Yuji right in front of him with a ticked off expression. He did not want this guy here. He wanted Gojo. Yet here was this pathetic little insect that dared think he could even challenge him. As he looks completely disgusted by Yuji's presence, telling Yuji that he stunk and telling Yuji that he looked straight up pathetic, but Yuji not saying anything more, as he would continue to stare down at Sukuna. Now Sukuna ends up looking at Yuji for a solid moment before suddenly smirking, as this is when he then disappears before slamming Yuji in the gut, as Yuji ends up collapsing down to the ground, gasping for air. As Sukuna would then laugh at the display before asking Yuji in the most serious tone possible if he remembered exactly what he told him. As the very time that Yuji had made that deal with Sukuna, Sukuna had swore that the very first person that he's going to kill once he exits out of the prison that he was in, that he was going to kill Yuji, not Gojo. And Yuji, after laying down on the ground and seemingly just falling unconscious after that one blow, as Sukuna looks down in disgust, actually about to spit on Yuji, this is when suddenly he ends up seeing that the entire reality that he was in was warped. As he would then be surprised as then the situation has turned, as now he was the one laying on the ground. Not only that, but he was bleeding from the mouth, and to make him worse was the fact that Yuji was looming over him. As Yuji would then tell Sukuna to remember the words that he said, as he then tells Sukuna that he would be expecting him. As this would cause Sukuna to immediately be pissed off, as he ends up getting some distance away from Yuji, while immediately using reverse curse energy to recover from the blow that Yuji had damaged him with, as he ends up telling Yuji that he's going to enjoy killing him, with Yuji stating nothing more. As this is when we actually get a good look at Yuji's appearance, as the first one that Sukuna had saw was none other than a Genjutsu, not that they really know what that is. As turning to Yuji's appearance right now, we see him wearing the same attire as he did in the main timeline, but the real difference here being the fact that number one, Yuji's arms have changed, and not only that, but also Yuji's eyes have changed as well, or more like an eye has changed. As while Yuji has still one eye with the Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, the other one had the Rinnegan. As Sukuna stares down at Yuji's appearance for a solid moment before laughing as he tells Yuji that he looks even uglier than before, with Yuji not saying anything as he was completely serious. As this will mark the very beginning of the fight between the King of Curses going up against the universe's biggest mistake. As after staring down at each other for a certain moment, this is where we then see both Yuji and Sukuna then rush at each other, both of them exchanging blows immediately. But to Sukuna's absolute surprise though, when he exchanges blows with Yuji, he'll see that every last one of his hits will go right through Yuji. He'll be caught off guard by this, as this is when he ends up getting cut right into the side of his face, as Yuji ends up using this opportunity to land him with a powerful uppercut in the stomach. As of course this will cause Sukuna to take massive damage. As we would see Yuji then kick Sukuna away, as Sukuna will be flung into a building, taking even more massive damage, as he would then recover from it using his reverse curse energy. He begins questioning Yuji about the stupid gimmick that he created, with Yuji not saying anything more, with Sukuna getting pissed off as this is when he then begins to activate his malevolent shrine, and Yuji seeing this immediately decided to counter with his infinite Tsukuyomi. Both domain expansions would then activate, but to Yuji's actual surprise, he'll see that his domain was overpowered by Sukuna's, as Sukuna begins to bombard Yuji with a bunch of slashes. As Sukuna begins smiling at the display that was happening right in front of him, thinking that Yuji had taken massive damage, or better yet he had died, this is when he would then be surprised to see that Yuji was just simply and calmly walking through the slashes. As even though multiple slashes were being sent out, Yuji was calmly walking through them. In fact, he didn't even look phased. There was not a slash on his clothing or anywhere on him. He was A-okay. Sukuna looks at the scene in complete surprise until Yuji ends up disappearing and appearing right in front of him as he then knees Sukuna in the stomach. The King of Curses ends up flinching over before screaming out at Yuji's name as he then punches the guy in the face, or at least he attempts to, as once again, his arm just phases right through it. He ends up cursing as Yuji as well as Sukuna continue fighting with each other, with Sukuna now being the only one to take damage. As Sukuna once again gets multiple cuts on his body thanks to Yuji using Dismantle, this is when Sukuna then tries once again to use his domain expansion, with Yuji responding, as Yuji would counter with his own domain. And this would actually surprise Sukuna, considering the fact that he would have thought for sure that Yuji wasn't going to be able to use his domain expansion again, as was everyone else. But this is when Yuji actually ends up revealing that throughout the time of becoming a sorcerer, Yuji's reserves have skyrocketed to the point where it even surpassed that of Yuta. As currently right now, Yuji's own reserves at the very moment were countering that of the King of Curses, and this will just piss off Sukuna even more. As both domains would clash with each other, unfortunately once again Yuji's domain loses, which causes the boy to curse, as Sukuna once again bombards Yuji with a bunch of slashes. But just like last time, Yuji just calmly phases through them. And this time, having enough of this ginormous shrine, this is when Yuji then decides to destroy it. As after Sukuna gets annoyed by this as he rushes at Yuji, Yuji actually ends up avoiding Sukuna's attack once again, just simply phasing right through it before landing Sukuna with a black flash. As this will cause the sorcerer to be sent flying into his shrine, but before he can even recover or try to counter, this is when suddenly Yuji would then send out a piercing flame, as this will cause it to pierce directly through the malevolent shrine, causing it to be destroyed, and preventing Sukuna from activating it for a temporary amount of time. Now Sukuna ends up getting annoyed by this as he ends up coughing up more blood, just as Yuji then releases a ginormous stream of fire. Now Sukuna ends up looking at the flames with an annoyed expression as he ends up sending a dismantle through it, cutting it apart immediately. As he ends up cursing out Yuji's name once again, Yuji appears right in front of Sukuna as he prepares to land him with another blow. But just as he does so, this is when Sukuna then smirks. As appearing out of his shadow, this is when we would then see Maharaga, as Yuji ends up hitting it instead, with it not even responding from the blow, just simply looking at Yuji before trying to swing at him using the Sword of Execution. Now Yuji looks at the sword before scoffing, as this is when the blade would then phase right through Yuji, as Maharaga immediately began trying to think of strategies in order to solve this. But right before he could do so, this is when Yuji would then appear right in front of it, as he would then tell Maharaga that it was getting in the way, as Yuji would then kick Maharaga away before suddenly releasing a generous stream of flames, as Maharaga will be getting burned to a crisp. But before it can be burned completely though, this is when suddenly Sukuna would then intervene, as finally, for the first time in the fight, Sukuna had actually been able to land a blow on Yuji, as Yuji ends up getting punched in the face by Sukuna, with Sukuna laughing at the display. Now fortunately for Yuji, he's able to recover from it relatively easily, as after all, he has taken worse blows from this. As Sukuna continues mocking Yuji for that display, this is when Maharaga as well as Sukuna then begin to actually tag team against Yuji, with Yuji facing off against the two of them. Using both Cleave and Dismantle, Yuji begins to use it on the both of them, with Maharaga adapting and Sukuna trying his best to avoid. And soon after realizing that even with the two of them, Yuji was still putting up a good fight, Sukuna decides to be even more petty as he decides to reveal the new Nue, as by this point he had absorbed a couple more of the Shikigami and merged them all with Nue, causing this new appearance to be formed. As Sukuna ends up telling Yuji that this was going to be a 3v1, Yuji just simply scoffs, telling Sukuna that was the only thing he was ever good for, relying on other people because the fact he knows that his own strength is lacking. And this will cause Sukuna to immediately get pissed off, as both him and Yuji immediately begin facing off against each other, with Yuji now getting jumped by all three of them. This is when Yuji, after planning things out accordingly and after getting sent flying out the building, still using the Kamui to avoid taking heavy damage, this is when Yuji then finds out that the Nue just simply could not keep up with them. As after once again phasing through another attack, this is when Yuji would then stare at the Nue before telling it to get out of his way, as this is when Yuji would then release a stream of flames from his mouth. Now this will cause the Nue to actually be burned out completely, but just as it does so, this is when Maharaga then intervenes, as it would then slash at Yuji, and to Yuji's actual surprise, he would actually end up getting a cut mark as the attack actually went through the Kamui dimension. As Sukuna, seeing the display, would then begin to laugh, telling Yuji that he isn't as invincible as he thinks he is, with Yuji just scoffing, as this is when he then surprises Sukuna by activating his reverse curse energy, telling Sukuna that he did all that just for a simple drop of blood. How pathetic for a king. And immediately after hearing this, Sukuna got even more pissed off, reminding Yuji that he was beneath him, and telling Yuji that he was nothing more but an abomination that simply got birthed into this world. With Yuji countering back that if he was an abomination, then Sukuna was a shit stain that the world just simply could not get rid of, until now. As this will cause Sukuna to be pissed off, as they immediately begin bickering with each other before once again fighting, as Yuji ends up punching away Maharaga, sending him flying as he gets back into close combat with Sukuna. Now Sukuna once again sees his attacks just phasing throughout Yuji, as Yuji continues trading blows with Sukuna. And eventually though, after going back and forth for quite a while, this is when, to Sukuna's surprise, Yuji does not land not one, not two, not even three, but a total of 5 black flashes in that fight, as he lands them all on Sukuna, with Sukuna nearly fading out of consciousness in every last one of them. And this causes Sukuna to curse out Yuji, with Yuji then releasing a dismantle that cuts apart a generous building along with Sukuna in it, with Sukuna recovering from it only because of the fact that he has reverse curse energy. As Yuji continues facing off against Sukuna, as he then rushes at him once again, ready to land another black flash, this is when Mahoraga would then appear, as he would then intervene, taking the black flash, but once again, just simply shrugging it off and continue fighting. As Yuji continues getting more and more annoyed with Mahoraga, as he continues getting jumped by the two of them, this is when suddenly he then ends up revealing his next trump card. This being the fact that Yuji actually ends up using blood manipulation. Yes, that's right. Throughout the entirety of the time skip, while Gojo was preparing to face off against Sukuna, Yuji was doing the same thing, as he was making sure to be strong enough in order to face off against the King of Curses. He has Yuta for training when it came to reverse curse energy, he went to Choso to get another power up, and overall he just learned as much as he could from everyone around him, as this allowed Yuji to become how he is right now. As he ends up using this blood manipulation to actually poison Sukuna, which the King of Curses tries to, shrug it off and everything, but this actually begins to have lasting effects on him, as he sees his movements becoming more sluggish and more slower, causing Yuji to just avoid him much easier and dealing more damage to him. As we end up seeing Yuji then land another black flash once again on Sukuna, as he would then be sent flying to another building, causing even more damage. This is when Yuji would then end up shooting out a piercing flame, but also a piercing blood, combining the two of them, as this will cause an exploding blood flame to actually end up hitting Sukuna and causing generous damage in the surrounding area. Now, just as Yuji does this is when once again Mahoraga would then intervene, with Yuji telling Mahoraga that he's finally got enough of him, as he ends up punching Mahoraga in the face, causing it to be sent flying in the air. And when he does, this is when he actually ends up using Mahoraga as a springboard, causing Yuji to be tossed up into the air, while Mahoraga and Sukuna then soon chase after him. As while Yuji is up in the air, this is when Sukuna finally ends up realizing the situation that they were in, as he didn't realize exactly what was about to happen and calls out for Mahoraga's name. As this is when Yuji, combining both his blood manipulation along with the fire jutsus that he's been having for a long time, this is when he ends up releasing a spiraling flame that was filled with blood as well, as this will actually end up hitting both Mahoraga as well as Sukuna, causing massive damage to Sukuna while at the same time completely obliterating Mahoraga. As this is when we would then see Yuji as he ends up appearing there, as to everyone else right now, they just see Yuji standing above the King of Curses as the winner, as finally it seems as if he won. As Yuji then approaches Sukuna about to comment that this was a good fight, this is when Yuji would then see the attack approaching. His eyes go wide, as this is when, just like that, Yuji would then be cut in half. As in the fight between Sukuna versus Yuji, supposedly the King of Curses had came out on top. As we end up seeing Sukuna get up, as he begins to compliment Yuji for all his improvements, telling Yuji that he actually had him a little while throughout the fight. But then he would then explain exactly why Yuji lost, explaining that the only reason why he came out on top was because of Yuji's philosophy, telling him that only those who are truly selfish can come out on top in this world, and telling Yuji that this is exactly the reason why he lost. As after this, everyone would just wait there in suspense as they were trying to get through the domain in order to get to Sukuna, but just as they were about to do so, this is when suddenly Sukuna would then be hit by Yuji's familiar voice. "Wake up to reality," Yuji would say, as this is when Sukuna would then go wide, as this is when he ends up looking around only to be seeing the devastating sight. As number one, the so-called dimension slash in this timeline is not the world slash, the dimension slash in this timeline had actually not hit Yuji at all. In fact, it had completely missed him. Yuji was on the other side as he actually tricked Sukuna by putting him under a genjutsu. This technique was something that Yuji had put off throughout the entire fight, using it as an ace in the hole, and it worked out exactly as he expected it. As Sukuna ends up looking at Yuji in complete shock, this is when he would then try to then activate his domain expansion one last time, and this time Yuji would counter it as well, both of them saying their domains, and to Sukuna's absolute surprise, his domain expansion, for the first time ever, had been outwitted by someone else's, as this is when Yuji ends up releasing the infinite Tsukuyomi. The entire world around them would then shift, but to Sukuna's absolute surprise, Yuji's domain had changed, as instead of being a closed-in domain like earlier, it was now an open domain, similar to Sukuna's, as he ends up looking at the scene in just complete shock, as Yuji ends up explaining that he did learn something from Sukuna, as after all, throughout the entire fight, Yuji has been wondering why his domain always lost against Sukuna's until now, as he finally figured out exactly how to open up his domain and actually make it to where it's similar to Sukuna's, allowing Yuji to actually overpower it, as now they were in Yuji's world. As Sukuna ends up staring down at the entire surrounding area, he curses as he tries to end up using his dismantle, only to realize that he can no longer move. As he finally ends up taking the situation, realizing that he was now fully at the mercy of Itadori Yuji. The very person that he was so very confident of defeating was now turning the tables on him. As this is when Sukuna would then hear Yuji's voice booming, as Yuji actually ends up revealing that he actually ended up taking a little bit of Sukuna's philosophy, explaining that throughout this entire time, Yuji was actually struggling mentally when it came to the whole philosophy that Sukuna had idolized, pretty much being completely selfish. I mean, throughout this entire time, Yuji has been sticking his neck out for everyone else, while at the same time, he's barely done things just for himself before. I mean, throughout this entire time, Yuji has been just completely out there, putting in work, putting in effort, working overtime for everyone else, to the point where he begins to actually forget about doing things for himself. But not anymore. Not at this very moment. As finally, for the first time ever, Yuji finally gets the opportunity to actually truly be selfish. And he was going to enjoy it to the fullest. As Sukuna ends up looking around, wondering where Yuji is, until finally he ends up looking up into the sky, only to see Yuji just casually floating up there. As Yuji be floating up into the skies with a dazed look, this is when he then begins to actually mention that he actually is a flaw of this world. Saying that already for the longest time, Yuji felt as if he was out of place, that he just simply did not fit in with these stereotypes. But now, finally, at this very moment, Yuji finally understood exactly what he was here for. As Yuji didn't even care if he was a flaw or an abomination, he knew his purpose. As if Yuji was a flaw, then he was a flaw that balanced out the chaos that existed in this world. As after saying these words, Yuji would end up looking at Sukuna with the most peaceful look that Sukuna has ever seen. Something that pissed him off, yet at the same time just completely shocked him. As Yuji ended up explaining that finally he's at peace with himself. As finally, after saying these words, this is when Yuji would then activate the domain. As we would then see the infinite Tsukuyomi then activate on Sukuna. As he ends up cursing, as he tries his best to actually swap out with Megami, but at this very moment, there was nothing he could do. As just like that, the King of Curses would then be hit by the infinite Tsukuyomi, as he will be laid to rest. As this will be the end for the King of Curses. As now with Sukuna's end now completely announced by this point, Yuji would then deactivate the domain and everything, as by this point, Sukuna has just completely been sealed away. The infinite Tsukuyomi is infinite. He's not going to be escaping out of it. As now that Sukuna had been sealed away, now the only person left to take over the wheel was none other than Megami. As Megami finally ends up taking over the wheel and everything, as now that Sukuna no longer has a hold over him, he's finally able to gain back control. And when he does, he immediately begins rushing over to Yuji, asking him about what happened to his sister, not really caring about the whole fight that went down or the fact that his body is in pretty bad condition. As Yuji, after hearing this, just simply and calmly explains that his sister is alright. As after all, in this timeline, thanks to Yuji actually being able to fight Sukuna for much longer and actually forced him and Urumi to actually make an escape, this will cause Sukuna to have barely any energy when it comes to facing off against Megami's sister. And not only that, but he had been able to escape from her thanks to Urumi assisting him. So with that, Megami's sister is still alive, and not only that, but she's no longer having her soul currently at the mercy of the other reincarnate. So basically, Megami's sister is okay. As Megami, after hearing this, will be so relieved, as he would then fall into unconsciousness, as Yuji's domain that currently covered the entire area had been finally released. As this is when suddenly rushing over to Yuji would be none other than Gojo, as he ends up punching Yuji in the face, causing him to fall into the ground. As Gojo ends up telling Yuji that the entire fight was awesome, with Yuji commenting as to why exactly did Gojo hit him for that. Now, Gojo just simply casually tells him that he did it because he wanted to, which ends up leading to a very comedic effect as soon others would end up arriving. Now after this, they finally end up realizing that finally, for the first time in centuries, the King of Curses has been truly laid to rest. As now the only one that remains at the strongest at this very moment, well, they were going to say it was Gojo, but at this very moment, after seeing the fight that went down, it seemed to be very clear. It was Yuji. As now with that, this is where we then do another time skip. Now by the end of the entire fight against both Sukuna and Yuji, Kenjaku had been executed, as he had been killed by none other than Gojo. As Gojo had one last farewell with his best friend, as he had no choice but to send him off to the afterlife once again. As after Kenjaku had been defeated, and not only that, but now that the higher-ups had been completely obliterated thanks to Gojo as well, it was finally time for them to bring the new era of Jujutsu sorcerers in place. new teachers, new faculty, and not only that, but basically the new generation was stepping up to replace the old one. As Yuji would be currently right now one of the new generation, as he was currently filling in for Gojo as the strongest. As after all, throughout this entire point of the story, Yuji has finally reached that title, surpassing many sorcerers including Gojo, as he was now deemed as the strongest. As throughout the rest of Yuji's existence, he will spend his time helping and improving Jujutsu society, helping other sorcerers grow in power, and not only that, but making sure to keep the balance throughout the entire world. As with that, this will be the final moments that we end up seeing in the rest of this What If, as now with that, this will be the end to What If Yuji had Obito's abilities. Thank y'all so much for tuning to this What If. Hopefully you guys did enjoy my first ever JJK What If. It was definitely an experience and I really enjoyed it nonetheless. And if you guys want more JJK What Ifs, then please let me know, and I will probably end up making more of them in the future. If you guys don't, I'm really okay with it, as by the end of it, I'm just really glad that I had the experience nonetheless. But yeah, besides that y'all, it's your host Sage Decent right here, and he's signing off. So peace, and have a lovely day.